Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Wisconsin Book Festival. It's really exciting to be here, especially since Wisconsin plays a rather outsized part in my story. So I'm here to talk to you about my book, Shadow Network, and it's the explanation of a puzzle that began somewhat on the evening of November 8th, 2016. But in other ways, the puzzle began a long time before that. I was sitting in front of my television, like many other Americans, and looking at my phone to see that the New York Times was predicting that Hillary Clinton had an 85% chance of a victory at the time the polls closed. And she had been endorsed by 57 of the 100 largest newspapers in the United States, compared to 2 that endorsed her opponent. So people I knew, myself included, believed we understood the situation, and the coverage made coherent sense. Also, Clinton's positions on social issues corresponded to the majority of public opinion. Positions on questions like her pro-choice position, civil rights for the LGBT population, gun control. So here she had the majority of public opinion, she had the newspapers of America behind her, she had the analysis of the New York Times, and yet, the November surprise. She won the popular vote by 3 million, but she lost the Electoral College by 80,000 votes in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Less than 1% in each case. So Michigan and Wisconsin had been traditionally Democratic states that the party had more or less taken for granted, and yet things went the other direction. My background in journalism and human rights documentation meant that the first thing I wanted to do was try to figure out why, and do it through research. And so I began to investigate how this happened, especially with a candidate with as many liabilities as Donald Trump. And I don't need to go into those here. They were adequately documented. So a few years and 1,000 footnotes later, I'm afraid, here we are. And you don't have to read the footnotes, but they're there if you want to see where I find every assertion I make. As Fred mentioned, I had something of advantage. I was born and raised in Oklahoma. And to my knowledge, I was the first female from an Oklahoma high school to graduate from Yale College. A low bar, I know, but I'll take it. So over the past decades, I've shuttled back and forth between New York City, where I've lived and taught at Columbia, and Oklahoma to visit friends and family. So part of the story unfolded there. Oklahomans, like Wisconsins, spend a lot of time in the car. And a lot of time in the car means a lot of time with the radio on. And when I began this investigation, I stopped listening to NPR and started listening to the fundamentalist radio stations. I heard a lot of political coverage, and it went like this. Hillary Clinton is a demon. Beto O'Rourke is the son of Satan. This was on the news broadcast, which was factually difficult to demonstrate. Then I started mapping out these radio networks across the country, and I found that they represented hundreds of stations, more or less concentrated in swing states, where in many places they outnumbered NPR stations with news coverage, for example, and in many cases they had stronger signals. So in a place like Oklahoma, you go from town to town, and you're always picking up one of these signals as you drive from one place to the other, where NPR kind of fades in and fades out. So I learned that 3 of these networks, representing hundreds of stations, were run by members of a shadowy group called the Council for National Policy. And I have to admit that before I began this research, I hadn't heard of it. So I started digging into it. And I learned that its leadership included the DeVos family from Michigan. And lo and behold, and mysteriously, after the election, Betsy DeVos, with very few educational credentials, becomes the Secretary of Education and sets about actively defunding public schools. Another member was Kellyanne Conway. Another member was Steve Bannon. So this looked like ripe material for research. The president of the Council for National Policy, Tony Perkins, was a fellow Oklahoman. and I'd been listening to him on the radio. Now, he had written major chunks of the Republican Party platform. A Southern Baptist minister from Oklahoma who ran the Family Research Council. This wasn't exactly processing. And the chunks of the platform he wrote involved purging transsexual members of the military, even though the Pentagon opposed it. Other issues that they were promoting was to promote conversion therapy for homosexuals, which is regarded as counterproductive and damaging by the American Medical Association. So Tony Perkins, I learned, became one of President Trump's spiritual advisors. And his Evangelical Advisory Council was dominated by fundamentalist members of the Council for National Policy. Now, Obama had a spiritual advisory council as well, but his included Catholics, Jews, Protestants, and Muslims. Donald Trump's had no Jews, no Catholics, no Muslims. It didn't even have mainline Protestants like Methodists and Presbyterians, even though he was supposed to be a Presbyterian himself. It was fundamentalist, evangelical, and very, very unidirectional. So, with the help of some intrepid research assistants from Oxford, the University of Southern California, and Harvard, I continued to connect these dots. I started with a deep history of the movement, and it began in the segregationist South. This was where I was a child in the 1960s, going to segregated schools in Oklahoma. And I found that the backlash to the civil rights movement in the South and the Southwest was an integral part of this movement that combined with the extractive industries. You had the oil industries wanting to maximize profits, and the social issues and the economic issues joined forces in this movement. The CNP was founded in 1981 in the wake of Reagan's election, and Reagan held himself up as a harbinger of a kind of religious theme to the presidency. He didn't always satisfy his fundamentalist supporters because he did appoint some moderates to his cabinet, and he was more interested in promoting his economic policy than he was pushing their social issues. So the Council for National Policy and its affiliated organizations had a kind of complicated dance with the Republican Party for the next 20 years, where they would lend their support to candidates who promised to support them, but then often experience disappointment when Republicans made alliances with moderate Republicans and even Democrats across the aisle on certain subjects. They knew that they had a minority in the population, and they understood that their advantages lay in the Senate and the Electoral College, which could give an advantage to less populated states and rural regions of other states. So they devised a strategy which was really quite sophisticated, which involved letting the Democrats focus on the popular vote and the national news media, while they focused on these strategies to activate evangelical votes in swing states. They understood that within our electoral system, the popular vote is indeed irrelevant. The Electoral College calls the shots, and if they could win the Electoral College by whatever means, they would occupy the administration. So one of the mottos of the movement is, God doesn't need a majority. So they proceeded with this, but in order to execute their plans, they needed money, media, and ground troops. So the money poured in. It poured in from the DeVos family. It poured in from oil barons from Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma. And they were interested in fighting the environmental regulations that were beginning to be instituted. They regarded Richard Nixon as something of a traitor because he established the Environmental Protection Agency during his administration. And they opposed it and, in fact, sought to abolish it altogether. Their media came through fundamentalist broadcasting. And it wasn't only these radio networks, it was also television networks, such as the Christian Broadcasting Network and the Trinity Broadcasting Network. And this occurred over a period of American history when you had various broadcasting regulations that were changing. There had been a fairness doctrine that required equal time for opposing parties on issues and candidates. That was dropped. So these broadcasters were able legally to broadcast uncontested arguments in favor of one body of the political movement over another. And the radio stations proliferated. You also had new technologies that facilitated this. You had the advent of cable television. So at one point, you had some 80% of American households tuned to the network news at the dinner hour. There are some people in this room who can probably remember the broadcasts of Uncle Walter, Mr. Cronkite, who told us all in a very reassuring way what had been professionally reported in the world and how we might respond to it. Well, that changed. With the advent of cable network and the dropping of the fairness doctrine, you had a proliferation of cable channels that were representing opinion over reporting and were representing contention and shouting matches over fact-finding. And so you had a loss of this broadcast news culture in much of the public, and it was replaced by people who were not really exercising a professional allegiance to facts. All of this served the purpose of a movement that wanted to downplay facts in favor of their ideology. The ground troops came through membership organizations, and as I looked through the roster of the Council for National Policy, I found the head of the National Rifle Association as one of their most active members. I found the head of the anti-abortion organization, the Susan B. Anthony List. Now, this was an interesting organization. It had been founded in response to Emily's List, which sought to raise money for female candidates of all kinds. So this organization, the Susan B. Anthony List, claimed to be representing the position of Susan B. Anthony in opposing abortion. The Susan B. Anthony scholars say that this is fabricated, that the quote that they're using in their defense is not legitimate. But they're using her name nonetheless and organizing women who go door to door, make phone calls, and get engaged in political activity while they're operating like the NRA under a tax-exempt status as a social welfare organization. Another head of an organization who belongs to the Council for National Policy is the head of the Tea Party Patriots. So here you have a network of donors who can write checks in the 6 and 7 figures and operate as a consortium and fund each other's organizations in a circular manner. You have a network of media that started with radio and expands out to television broadcasting, and you're talking about massive audiences. I didn't watch the fundamentalist television broadcasters very much before I started this project, but I learned that they can command 100 million viewers. So you have a sizable contingent of people who are getting a very one-sided representation of our political life. Then you have these organizations branching out. One of the largest of these, whose owners are in the leadership of the Council for National Policies, is the Salem Media Network. Salem is a massive media organization in the United States. It has many radio stations in critical areas, but it also has a large number of online platforms. It has a book publishing company where best-selling books are published. It's multi-platform, and it has an extremely large reach, which is, I would guess, largely invisible to, say, the listenership of National Public Radio. Over the past 20 years, these organizations have benefited from what I call a colony collapse of American professional journalism. What you've had in the last 20 years is a number of newspapers, a large number of newspapers that have closed, especially in the middle of the United States. You have tens of thousands of American journalists who have devoted their careers to learning rigorous fact-based reporting who have been thrown out of work. Why? Well, the first reason was technological change, and when the ad revenues that used to go to newspapers and classifieds and display advertising migrated online. And so the advertising that used to support these reporters who were serving their communities, and they were serving in City Hall, they were serving in the state houses, they were serving in investigating the role of money in politics. All of a sudden that function is gone, and in many cases it's replaced by useless clickbait. So that has been a major issue. Right now, in the last 20 years, we've lost 1/3 of our full-time state house reporters in this country. How are we ever supposed to know what our legislators are doing if nobody's keeping an eye on them? You also have the disappearance of the audience for these newspapers, and so you have a less informed electorate, and you have more and more of your citizens semi-informed, misinformed, and disinformed by the other media that arise to fill the vacuum. So here you have this issue that allows the movement to make gradual progress, and they refine their strategy over the years. They chose certain states. Ohio was one bellwether state where there were a lot of experiments, shall we say, in activating certain parts of the electorate and suppressing other parts of the electorate. And so going through the 1990s, which I document thoroughly in my book, you have very critical elections affected by leading members of the Council for National Policy, including Kenneth Blackwell, who was the Secretary of State in Ohio, at the same time that he was representing Republican interests. And there were some investigations into his activity that did not reflect on him well. But this all continued, and they were making gradual progress until 2008. Barack Obama won the election, and he won it in a landslide. There were many disturbing things to them about this. First of all, Barack Obama was the Council for National Policy's worst nightmare. Let's leave aside for the moment his identity and look only at his policies. He was representing women's rights, he was supporting marriage equality, and he was advancing environmental regulations energetically. And this was anathema. But there was also a kind of insult to it, because Barack Obama was a very modern candidate, and he had one of the most advanced digital campaigns that anyone had ever seen. So he had a team of young technologists that figured out some things about social media. And they figured out how to energize certain portions of the electorate through Facebook and other social media feeds. They learned how to collect some data on where the voters were, how they voted, and this was believed by many to have largely contributed to his victory, among other factors. So the CNP and its allies went back to the drawing board. This time, they had some new allies, because among other people who were very disturbed by the Obama victory were the Koch brothers. The environmental regulations were not to their liking. Their oil industries had been fined multiple times for degrading the environment in more ways than one can count. Oil pipe leakages, toxic residues. If you look at the part of the country I'm from, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, you have a cancer alley in Louisiana, you have oil spills. There's a broad disregard for environmental safety, and they have been fined, they have been taken to court, and they regard these actions to protect the public from environmental degradation as a means of hampering their profits. So they also didn't like being outsmarted. And the Democrats' data operation appeared to have done that. So at this point, the Koch brothers invest $50 million in a new data platform that is state-of-the-art. It was called I-360. And it started gathering data with the help of a company called Cambridge Analytica. And whereas the Democrats had been focusing on where the voter lived, what party they were registered for, whether they'd voted in the last election, this data platform went all out. It went after what you watched on Netflix. It went after what your cholesterol level is. It went after what you owe on your mortgage. And it compiled this and then made a system where it fed into and answered to door-to-door canvassers. So whereas a Democratic canvasser would knock on the door and know perhaps whether the person voted in the last election or not, their canvassers could go in and say, I know you had a burglary last year and you must be really frightened about your right to keep a firearm. So this was quite an innovation, and it was adopted and developed with more money and more independence than anything that the Democrats had. It was also offered on a subsidized basis to selected candidates. So one of those, who was one of the most advanced, was Ted Cruz. Now, there's many things people may not know about Ted Cruz. He comes from a very interesting family. His father was a pro-Castro Cuban revolutionary and a mathematician until he got religion and became a dominionist, fundamentalist preacher. Ted Cruz's mother was a computer scientist. And Ted Cruz became one of the true innovators in the use of digital campaign technology in the entire field. And he wedded this with his own allegiance to fundamentalist Christianity and the dominionist strain. So he and his technologists worked to develop an app with a company called UCampaign, and together there was a kind of harmony between the data platform and the app and the organizations represented in the Council for National Policy, such as the National Rifle Association and the Susan B. Anthony List and others. So it was a very sophisticated approach, and there was a chance to pioneer it in 2016 in the British campaign for Brexit. And what happened in this case was that the app was working with Cambridge Analytica and others to go to the British people and identify the ones who did not live in the large, sophisticated urban areas, the people who felt left behind by the new Britain. And they told them several things. They told them, and after test marketing many messages, but one of them was that belonging to the EU would lead for tens of millions of Turks to invade Britain and deprive them of their livelihoods. Another was that if they didn't go with the EU, that all of that money could be reinvested in the national health and improve their national health service. Neither of these things happen to be true. But through this method of identifying target voters, motivating them to go vote when they hadn't before, and energizing them with the messages of these falsehoods, they surprised everyone with the Brexit vote. And we see the United Kingdom still struggling with the results day to day. So they were very cheered by this laboratory experiment in their technology, and they turned to the U.S. primaries. Ted Cruz used a lot of these techniques in the Iowa primaries, where he did very well, but over time, he lost ground to an outsider, Donald Trump, who rode on the bandwagon of his bizarre charisma and his celebrity, to win enough primaries to become the Republican candidate. This caused a great crisis in this movement because many of the fundamentalist leaders had said Trump was not just their last choice out of 17 candidates. He wasn't even on the list. Many of them, such as the Southern Baptist leader Richard Land, had denounced him and published statements saying they would never support him. And Richard Land, as a member of the Council for National Policy and somebody who'd been very involved in the fundamentalist Get Out the Vote effort, was a true bellwether for the movement. Ted Cruz had called Trump a liar and other things. However, they were faced with this moment, which I describe in the book, where they had to choose between getting behind Trump and watching Hillary Clinton win the election. And they made their choice. And people often ask me regarding the book, how could the fundamentalists support someone like Trump who is so different from them culturally and in terms of character and values? I've read their books at great length and listened to their broadcasts extensively, so you may not have to. And what I found was that they said Donald Trump may not be a man of God, but he's an instrument of God. They call him Cyrus. And for the biblical scholars among you, you'll know that Cyrus was the Persian king who helped to restore the Jews to Jerusalem, not being Jewish himself, but serving as an instrument of God to achieve an end. So in order to navigate this critical moment in the campaign, there was a massive meeting called on June 21st, 2016, at the Marriott Marquis Hotel in New York at Times Square. They called 1,000 fundamentalist leaders to come and hear Donald Trump. And the leading figures from the Council for National Policy, including Tony Perkins and a number of other figures identified with them, set up a meeting where they would introduce Trump to the fold as someone that they could work with and get buy-in from their community, which would, they hoped, unlock the resources of the money, the media, and the ground troops. And so Trump appeared, and he represented himself, having been coached a bit, as a member of their fold. And when they all emerged, several elements of a major deal had occurred. So the first one was that members of the Council for National Policy, including Tony Perkins, would be writing portions of the Republican National Platform for the convention. That was agreed upon, and that was going to focus on these social issues. And they were largely going to concern women's and gender rights, and that indeed occurred. Another element of the deal was that the Evangelical Council began to be formed, and it was dominated by members of the Council for National Policy. And no other representations of American religious life, or indeed the growing number of Americans who do not have a religious affiliation. That was also agreed upon. And finally, and perhaps most critically, was the question of the federal judiciary. There was an agreement that Trump would appoint federal judges to the Supreme Court, the circuit courts, and the appeals courts from a list that these organizations had prepared. The list was drawn up by the Federal Society, the Heritage Foundation, National Rifle Association, which became an arbiter of judicial nominations. And after the Neil Gorsuch nomination, the White House published a video of them meeting with Trump in the White House to celebrate, and his thanking them for their support in the process. Federal Society, Heritage Foundation, and the NRA all run by members of the Council for National Policy. So let's think for a moment about our founding fathers. They instituted a system of checks and balances, as we all learned in high school civics courses. And the administration and the legislative branch and the judiciary are supposed to check excesses from each other. And over time, the federal courts are appointed as lifetime appointments. But the idea is that they will balance each other out and serve the cause of moderation and will reflect the way the public evolves to represent the American people. What do they deal with? Well, the federal courts deal with the social issues, such as marriage equality. They deal with women's issues, such as access to abortion and women's health care. They deal with issues around gerrymandering or not. They deal with voting laws and the way these are exercised in different states. They also deal with environmental regulations. So these courts are a key to power, and the Republican Congress had created a logjam of appointments for the Obama administration, which resulted in a record number of appointments to be made under the next administration, and those have gone on apace. Trump has appointed a record number of judges to federal judiciary spots, and they have already tipped one court. There are other courts that are being tipped from one persuasion to another. This could have a lasting effect on our life as a nation. And the other part of this is the level of qualification of these judges. The American Bar Association was asked by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower to create a rating system for judges' qualifications. And they have done that for every president until now. And a Republican president has gotten higher ratings than a Democrat. It's not a partisan exercise. It's looking at their professional qualifications. Trump has appointed a record number of judges who are deemed unqualified based on their ideological allegiance to this movement, as he agreed to do at the outset. So after the meeting at the Marriott Marquis, this whole movement turned on a dime. Land, who had denounced Trump and placed him last on his list, converted. The apps that were developed for Ted Cruz were converted to the Trump campaign. The ground troops went door to door. The candidate that they had opposed, they now supported. The media turned around and supported Trump. And all of this went into overdrive. Now, the Democrats had media and canvassers too, but the Republicans had a strategic advantage, which was that their data and their apps were, first of all, networked across the country. So state level fed into the master, and that was diffused to the candidates they supported across the country. And they were also networked into campaigners who were not campaigning on behalf of the Republican Party. They were campaigning on behalf of the National Rifle Association, the Susan B. Anthony list, and the other organizations by the tens of thousands. And that was involved in many states. So the question going into 2020 is whether this pattern will prevail. And I was able to follow the 2018 midterms very closely as I was writing the book. Now, the Democrats celebrated the fact that they won the House, which was corresponding to the general population. The Republicans won seats in the Senate, which was something that they emphasized in their campaign strategy. I looked at the Claire McCaskill campaign in Missouri as a case study and looked at the way the Trump organizations, the NRA, the Susan B. Anthony list, and others joined together and blanketed that state with anti-McCaskill activity. And you had the Republican Party doing its own work on the side, but you have it magnified and multiplied by these other forces, plus the media with radio stations that outnumber NPR, for example, in the state of Missouri. So what you have is a rather uneven playing field. And it's one that has continued to this day. At this point, the app developers added a special feature, which was a texting feature. Now, their argument was that the most likely people to get to vote would be older, white, fundamentalists, pressured by their religious communities. And while the Democrats were doing kind of fancy virtual reality on their apps, the Republican developer said that the killer app was text. That's what old people do. And so what they did was develop a series of apps. And when you don't read the 50 pages of permissions that nobody ever reads, and you just download the app, you have given it access to your entire directory in your phone. And at that point, you also have given them permission to send a personalized text from you to each person in your directory, telling them when and how and where to vote. Love, Aunt Judy, right? So in the world of technology, people don't like to think about retro media like radio and text. They always want to go after the shiny new thing. But this movement is very focused on what actually works and gets people to the polls to vote, and to vote in a certain way. One of the problems I have with it is that there is so much of it that is simply based on falsehood. Let's start with abortion, which is probably the main emphasis of their campaign. What they're saying in their broadcasts and their media is that Democrats are in favor of what they call birthday abortion. They say that Democrats want to execute babies on the day of their birth. I have scoured the public record every way I can. I have never found a Democrat, or actually anyone, who wants to execute babies on the day of their birth. But this has been said by Trump, by Cruz, by their media, and it is being promulgated not only in their radio programs, but I've seen animation films they have of near full-term babies being extracted from the womb limb by limb, arguing that this is what Democrats like to do. And it simply isn't true. I think there's an honest and important conversation to be had about abortion. I'm perfectly open to that, but it should be based on fact. And at this point, that's not what's happening. It's being used to rouse emotion through graphic and false depictions. And that is not the way our political system should operate. We also have the same apps and the same anti-abortion platform being implemented for the national elections in Canada. So right now, where we are is the public is captivated by the daily spectacle from the White House. It's what I call dust in your eyes. There's always something new to stare at, to wonder at, and that could be distracting the public from the main event. There's going to be an election next year, and it is going to have a determination of the future, not just of the country, but in many ways the future of the planet. And being distracted at this point is not a good idea. There's a lot of attention focused on the idea of impeachment. Well, it turns out that Mike Pence has been an ally of the Council for National Policy for over 20 years. And there are many signs, which I document in my book, that he was actually their preferred candidate. So it could be that everyone who's focused on impeachment may actually be serving their longer-term purpose. I wrote Shadow Network at a time when I dropped everything else I was doing because I thought it was important to provide all the documentation of this movement that I could. Whatever your political persuasion, I think it's important that American citizens know how this works, understand it, and then figure out how they respond to it. I don't claim it's the whole story. It's not the only story. But I do believe it's a significant part of the story. Ultimately, it's a question of our commitment to democracy. You know who won the election in 2016? Didn't vote. Trump got 27%, Hillary got 28%, didn't vote, got 40%. We should all care deeply about that. That was the combination of people who were eligible to vote and didn't register, 7%, people who were registered and didn't vote, 33%. So the future of the world rests on some people in some swing states. Not that many, because that's how our system works. And if people don't pay attention to it, they are ceding their vote for the future. I should add that voters over 65 are 30% more likely to vote than those under 30. So you have an entire generation of Americans who are ceding their future to people who won't be around to experience it. My last two books were on anti-Nazi resistance movements in Berlin and occupied Paris, so I've been working from the perspective of an historian. And I believe that when historians in the future look back on our time, they're going to ask whether we were willing to defend our democracy through the peaceful means we have at our disposal. And that, at the end of the day, is the ballot box. Thank you. I believe we can take questions, yes. Oh, I think you're supposed to get a microphone. But C-SPAN can't hear.
Pick it up on C-SPAN. Please use the mic over here.
Could you go to the mic for this? Are there any questions from someone willing to use the mic? What means for a French school in fall? Sure,
you connected many of the dots that I knew were out there. The only dot that you haven't connected at all is Putin and the Russian connection. And we've been seeing lately how greatly he is benefiting from all of this. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, since we can't necessarily back this up, so that's the first part, Putin, but also I'm wondering how distressed you might be about Catalonia. When you think about history and you think about riots in Spain about Catalonian independence. So, two-part question.
Yeah, well, I have, okay, the question was how I tie in what has happened with the Russian investigation. That's the first part. And the second part is how I respond to the riots in Catalonia. I've taught in Catalonia and Barcelona, but not for some years. And as someone who attempts always to be an evidence-based and fact-based reporter, I would rather know more about it before I opine. In terms of the Russia investigation, I knew there were many signs of connections as I was doing my reporting, and I had to limit what I was trying to do because, as you point out, there were already an awful lot of dots. However, after I finished the manuscript and as the book was already printed, the Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee published a report that stated that Maria Butina had been in touch with the National Rifle Association, and they published an email where the NRA offered to pay her way to the CNP meetings. And so where there's smoke, there may well be fire. And I guess the frustrating part about writing a book like this is when you do have to confine it. I felt that it would be good to publish it now, and that if I did it over a 3-year period, it might be a post-mortem, which was of less interest to me. So I did what I could in the time I had. And I hope lots of other people follow up because there's so many additional avenues for investigation, and you've named the first.
Given all your extensive research, is there anything that gives you hope?
The American people. I do believe in this country, and I think that this country has responded to periods of crisis in the past in ways that they didn't even know they could. But I also look at people as individuals. And again, my last two books about the anti-Nazi resistance in Europe, I'm writing about individuals who always recognized the Nazi threat. And when they undertook their most courageous actions, this was 1940, 1941, and every indication was that the Nazis had won the war. They hadn't invaded the Soviet Union yet, the US wasn't in on the war, so it looked like they were fighting an impossible enemy. They decided exactly what they could do, and they did it. And while their actions may have only affected a small percentage of the lives that they managed to save, those mattered. I mean, I was in Paris talking to 80-year-old children who'd been rescued by the network in Paris run by Suzanne Spa. I talked to people who were alive because a housewife decided to step out of her comfort zone and do something. Her motto was, il faut faire quelque chose. You got to do something. And so I think when people realize that the moment is all hands on deck for a democracy, and they put aside some of their personal interests, amazing things can happen. And again, 80,000 votes in 2016, you know, do the math about how small these margins are. Now, of course, there's a question of money, but it's not all money. A lot of, you know, what this movement has actually taught me is that the gold standard for political campaigns is not Facebook feeds. People click and move on. It is someone who takes the time to go door to door, see someone face to face, listen to them, speak to them, and hand them a piece of printed literature, hand to hand, and ask them to vote. That's what really works. And you know, these people are very clever in figuring it out. I was astonished to read that the Democratic National Party did not manage to get campaign literature to Wisconsin in 2016, much less have their candidate visit. So I believe people can learn. And as an historian, I will watch and see whether I'm right. Yes.
So that's actually a great segue to my question, and you sort of answered it, but I'll ask it anyway, which is we're in a very important state. So it sounds like one of the things we could do is go door to door, but do we want to go door to door in other areas? Because you know, we're kind of a blue district. And again, what is the single most important thing that those of us who want to do something outside of our comfort zone could do?
Yeah, well, I am not a political activist. I am somebody who wrote a book that explains the mechanics of a movement that has affected our national history. So I'm not going to be prescriptive. I can tell you that there are many organizations that are taking on that job, and you can look for them and you can decide what you think is going to be the most effective. That's all out there. But I do think I will be enough of an advocate to say getting out the vote is very important in a democracy. I don't think that's being partisan. And I do think that it's very important to help people understand that you can take a single issue like abortion and distort it and inflate it when people should be thinking about whether they have clean water to drink and whether their children can go to school and whether they have health care. And to sweep all of that aside over a falsely posited debate over abortion, I feel is inappropriate. And if you look at the voter guides of these organizations, climate and environment aren't even on the list. They don't exist. So they're making these cases for issues based on how much emotion they can arouse. And I have to say, it's pretty effective. But I do feel that there are probably strategists who could address this in effective ways too. Yes.
Do you have any indication yet that there are forces on the other side that have upped their arsenal to counteract this, what you've experienced, what you've written about here, in any effective way in this next election cycle? Do you see the tools being deployed now, matching what the firepower that's out there?
I have interviewed strategists from both the Republican and the Democratic Party. I do believe that both of them are ramping up their forces considerably. And people who are interested in following this might look at an article by Thomas Edsall in the New York Times about Trump's enormous war chest in buying Facebook ads. It was out last week, and that kind of updates some of the reporting that I have in the book. So I think that yes, both sides are upping their game. And both sides understand that this is kind of a sort of Armageddon, to use such language, because with another 4 years of this movement in power, you start to have the courts totally transformed. There are federal judges who have held on and even delayed their retirements because they don't want to be replaced by nominees from this administration. They could hold on for a year or two. They're not going to hold on for 5. So you could see the United States transformed into quite a different society with this. And I think that both sides realize it. But I have observed one thing. When I look at the Republicans and this movement, I say it runs like a corporation. Once they make a decision, it's command and control. Everything moves in the same direction. And you get the feeling that it's run by people who are business majors, right? The Democrats, more like lawyers. Let's all contest, and let's come up with every possible footnote to contest the other Democrat. And so there's a very divisive culture that goes on that you could say was kind of democratic in its way, but it's not always politically effective.
Good segue into my question. The GOP has become, as far as I'm concerned, a non-entity. They have really become a Trump party, and we have a morally corrupt president. So what do you see has led to the total co-opting of the Republican Party by Trump in his actions, and do you see any ability for the Republican Party to go back to the old moderate conservative party, or has it been lost forever, do you think?
Well, this is in my book. And what I describe is a set of tactics that evolve over time that are about purging moderates and reinforcing hardliners. And it actually starts with the Southern Baptist Convention in the 1960s in Texas, where moderates in the Southern Baptist Church leadership are purged by some questionable political tactics at the annual Southern Baptist Convention. And then it moves on to the National Rifle Association, which turns out used to be a patriotic marksmanship organization, which helped with gun safety and was not really so apart from the national feeling about gun safety and gun control. And there was something called the Cincinnati Revolt, where hardliners took it over, purged the moderate, and turned it into a political organization. And over time, the same thing happened with the Republican Party. There were many honorable Republicans we could all name who voted on legislation, worked across the aisle on issues, who were focused on making things work for people, and who supported critical issues in the environment and other areas of public life. And many of them were purged. And so you can go through chapter by chapter and see who and when they were. Can it be recovered? I believe that. I believe that, but that's an opinion. I'm sorry. I can't prove it. But I have a lot of Republican friends who are not only dismayed by the current state of affairs, and not only alienated by the Trump administration, they speak with a sense of personal betrayal. This is not the party that I belong to. This is not the party I supported. And I really hope they'll have something to go back to, because we need at least a two-party system. And we need honorable people on all sides. So, you know, this may be a chance for a kind of renewal of American democracy, she said optimistically.
And yet, evangelicals consider Trump the second coming, or there's something in it for them. The end of days. What are they getting out of this Trump administration? Why are they still sold?
Yeah. Well, one issue I had to deal with in the book was the question of some definitions, because there's not a bright line between Protestant, evangelical, fundamentalist, and I had to use some shorthand because there just aren't precise definitions. I will say that within the evangelical community, there are many different strains of social attitudes. And there are people such as the group called the Red Letter Christians, who are evangelicals, who subscribe to the idea that Christianity involves the words of Jesus printed in red letters in the New Testament, such as the Beatitudes, right, which aren't big factors in the movement I described. So I don't think it's right to lump anyone together into a single category. And I do feel that many of the fundamentalists who have been led to support the current administration are questioning it on many counts. Right now, you do see a parting of the way on the issue of the Kurds. There's a lot of questioning about Trump's policies and about his decision-making process on that count. And I also suggest that anybody who's seriously engaged in this topic look at some of the more serious analysis that's available. My absolute favorite is Larry Sabato's operation out of the University of Virginia. And he has a center that analyzes polls and political trends in a very academically sound way. And it's called Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball. I don't think he predicts the future, but he charts the present with, I think, a fair amount of precision. So I think that's really important, because there will be a very small group of states that will define the future. And I tell people, I live in New York, I vote in New York, and that's totally irrelevant. My vote has no count. And my parents live in Oklahoma, their vote has no count either. There will be about 5 or 6 states that, as I say, will determine the future of the country and perhaps the world. And current signs are that Wisconsin is one of them. So, we're done? Thank you.